This is a question and answer session for the SAFF Film Festival for 2024. It's focused on Kevin Harris and his film True Patriot, which is the film about John Harris. And we're speaking amongst Kevin Harris, who's the filmmaker, and Jane Harris, who is the sister of John Harris. And I point out that they are not related. And I have the privilege as the person who is hosting this Q&A session. So the subject is fairly and squarely about John Harris. And I'd like to talk to the two discussants, starting with you, Jane.
Right.
For me, seeing you in the film, True Patriot, it tells me that you are talking to us having lived the experience. This is a personal, this is a powerful discussion with you about being there at the time of the occurrences, but also living with all the consequences that followed in the period immediately after the bombing occurred, and also how you lived with what occurred thereafter. Just turning quickly then to Kevin. Kevin is here because he is a distinguished filmmaker who's made this film against a background of many other searching and important films about the apartheid struggle, amongst other things, but has done this as an independent documentary maker. Kevin's professional life in this field took off when he was sacked by the South African Broadcasting Corporation during the apartheid era, when his film Barrow, which was about the dreadful occurrences at Baragwanath Hospital in Soweto, was portrayed in a film he made, and he refused to have it censored. So I think the credibility of both discussants is well established. Just to say that Kevin has gone on to make many other documentaries of human rights issues, of human interest, social justice issues, and has made over 35 feature documentaries to date. As far as True Patriot is concerned, it was released in 2022. So that's the background. Let's talk to you first, Jane. Looking at your contribution, I saw a very powerful and personal contribution that you made that stood out against the other interviews that are depicted in the film. And I think it's the personal nature that stands out because of this. I'd like to ask you whether you can talk about what drew you to want to contribute to the making of this film, and recognizing, I think, that it had to have been a very painful and distressing experience potentially for you. Could you talk about that?
Well, I think, obviously, that part of my life has been extremely significant. And having said that, of course, we are now a number of years later. I have a very different life. I live in Australia, etc. Having said that, I mean, my first indication of what was going to happen was in a car trip with my brother. And as I've said before, when John said you were going to do something, you did not argue, which was a character study, but it was true. And I remember his saying that he wished to put in our flat. My husband Drew and I lived in a flat in Hillbrow, and he wished to leave a suitcase of dynamite. And this was the first indication I had had that things, well, one had no indication of where they were going to go, obviously, and they went in very, very unusual, in a way, ways. So we did know that something was going to happen. And having said that, I had always been in South Africa. I was involved in the Liberal Party, which was at that point was fairly important. And then they they decided they would no longer be there because of it was going to be it was not allowed to have mixed racial parties. And so I was very, very strongly of the opinion that what John was doing, I don't think I had an actual opinion. I think what comes across to me when I think about it now is his incredible, and all of us, naivety, that we had no concept, which we should have had, because we'd been involved we'd lived through the whole anti-apartheid era and all their brutality and all their cynicism, and we should have realized this. We didn't.
I'm going to stop you there and just draw you into the engagement in the film itself, because
Yes.
You've covered this well in the actual film,
Yeah.
as to how you stood and how you related to your brother. But when the opportunity to make the film arose for you to be involved in it, I was wondering what sort of reaction that evoked for you.
Well, I feel that it is important that the history of that period should be documented. And the fact that obviously this was going to cause many memories to surface and many perhaps insignificant little events to come to the surface. But I felt that it was important, to answer your question, to be able to have a record of what John did and the entire complexity of it. It has never, to me, been a simple issue. That the whole system of racism was simple, and the whole system of apartheid. But to answer your question, I felt that it was important to have documentation on what was an extremely significant and tragic episode in the history of South Africa. Does that answer your question?
And it takes us to the next part of the question, which was observing your contribution during the film. It appeared to me that there was an emotional process unfolding, in that as you were exploring this, your engagement with the potential audience was deepening. Was that an experience you had when you were being interviewed and providing the account?
Yes, I think in a way, yes, in the sense that as one is talking about a specific issue, one thinks of something, and then this, in a way, leads to another aspect of it. So therefore, the whole period for me is still extremely clear. Every single detail of what occurred is there because it was of such significance. And therefore,
were there additional insights that emerged in the course of that process? And if so, can you tell us about those?
Not specifically, but I think to refer to what I said before, as one was talking to Kevin, or if I talk to anybody, yet another aspect appears, as it were, because at the time when this was all occurring, just as a PS, for example, my husband and I, John Drew, my then husband, was John's best friend, and we were both very, very involved in the whole thing. We were involved in the having to care for my parents. But there, as you say, at times, all sorts of seemingly unimportant issues or details would have come to mind. Now, having said that, I cannot say what they were. But, I'd suddenly think, oh, yes, I remember when the special branch rang on the door and rang the doorbell and this sort of thing.
Well, I can well understand that those would remain with you as very, very powerful and poignant memories, inescapable. Perhaps to turn to Kevin. Kevin, looking at your substantial body of work as a documentary filmmaker, particularly dealing with South Africa, the history during the apartheid era, I was wondering what it was about the story of John Harris that drew your attention particularly, because there was a backdrop of just so much other compelling material um, that was there, I guess, for a filmmaker to work with.
Right, and just to say thank you so much to Jane, because her interview was really quite something. It was so personal and so intimate that it gave uh, yeah, it contributed enormously to the documentary and to the integrity of the documentary. You know, Michael, I think it's difficult to pinpoint exactly, but as a filmmaker like myself and being a South African and wanting to tell the stories of South Africa, I think it's a story that was always in the back of my mind. I mean, I think when I was 14 when the whole situation happened. And there wasn't, for me, there were so many unanswered questions. And as I think as I grew up, I became aware that this was a story that had never been honestly told. It was told in one dimension, kind of. So, yeah. And I think that after when transformation was happening, and Hugh Lewin came back into the country, and I became aware that, oh, okay, you know, Hugh and his relationship with John, and I went. Hugh was where it all started, and I went to see Hugh and just, you know, introduced myself to him, and then, you know, the thing about filmmaking for me, it's not just about recording the historic content. For me, it's about storytelling. And the more I investigated and got to know about, you know, the story of John and what had happened, you know, the more important the story became as a story, because it's a human interest story about a man who, living in a time in a context of very dramatic political developments, and I mean, he was naturally being influenced by all these events. He finds himself, he belongs to the African resistance movement, and through circumstances and everybody being detained, he finds himself the last man standing in this whole struggle for social justice and against apartheid. And you know, he finds himself in a position where he feels that it's up to him. He's got to actually find a way of making a statement to actually tell the world and South Africans that there are white South Africans who are totally opposed to apartheid. So he thinks this through very carefully, and comes up with a plan and a strategy, and takes into consideration what steps he will take to make sure that nobody is injured, nobody is killed. And he makes, you know, he makes 3 warning phone calls, and these are ignored strategically by the powers that be. And you know, so this tragedy happens, and it is for me, yeah, what eventually my conclusion was that it is a tragedy. And I've my log line basically is that, you know, the road to hell is paved with good intention, and John's intention were absolutely honorable. They were yeah, and it just all went wrong. And you know, he went through hell. He went through absolute hell as a consequence. And, you know, and then he had this modest last request that one day in a free and democratic South Africa, on his tombstone should be written, John Harris, true patriot. And I just felt it, yeah, it's, you know, such a poignant conclusion to his whole story. And the thing is that, you know, what it says to viewers, or what it should say to you, or if, you know, if I was watching it, is, you know, if you were John, what would you have done? If you were John's parents, you know, do you have a son in his 20s? How would you have felt if your 20-something-year-old son, who happens to be very committed and headstrong, and with every good intention, had done what John had done? And then, you know, the awful how would you feel if your 20-something-year-old son had been hanged to death? And those, for me, are the human interest points about the story, and the story that has evolved, and that I feel that audiences would engage on.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's so compelling, and it has so much relevance in the sense of the story is clear and one can relate to it, and anybody with any understanding of the South African anti-apartheid story would have very little difficulty in understanding it. The central issue that I felt was the underreporting and the lack of awareness about the failure to take the warnings, because that really was such a major and cynical political step that, yes, it was stated, but it appears in small print almost in media coverage of the time, and of course in the actual prosecution, it probably had very little emphasis, because the will was so strong to create a different picture. But I think you've definitely described how the story needed telling and captures the audience. I wonder, I suppose it's redundant, but just if there's anything else about how you entered into that process and what it revealed. And I'm thinking in particular, meeting someone like Jane and meeting some of the other people who you were able to interview, and really looking at mature people reflecting on what young people thought and did in that era.
Yes, well, the story grew, and that's what basically happened. I mean, I started with Hugh, and then Hugh put me in touch with David Wolf, and then David. I was doing another film at the time. I mean, you have to do this, you have to do. I mean, this film took a long time to make. It was in 2010 that I actually first engaged Hugh. And so from 2010, basically, and then I think 2011, 2012. So he introduced me to David, and he put my credentials to the family as I'd asked him to, and I took it from there. And so I was going overseas to do another film. I had to go and shoot some stuff. So I went to London, met David, and had a session discussing with him. And then the next day we set up for the on-camera interview. And then that interview that he gave in the film, that was done in 2011, 2012, I think. So slowly. And then he introduced me to his aunt, Jane, and then Jane was coming to South Africa for a visit, and we connected and we met and we chatted and whatever, and then we set up to do the interview with her while she was in South Africa, and so the story grew. And then of course David revealed about Lynn, his sister, and of course, I mean, so the human interest story is just growing and growing and growing. And then I made contact with Lynn, and so it went, and of course then Sister Catherine and her whole story. It's
going to be curtailing just because we have such limited time, but this is the fascination of the backstory, and I'm so pleased that you've added to it. And I'm sure, Jane, I saw you nodding, that it was all part of that experience that I was trying to extract, that it did grew and it needed telling, and I can understand that. As somebody who viewed the film, and I've done that a number of times now, I have made mention of how different age groups in the contemporary setting would view this, and also the differing awareness that people would have with the history of the anti-apartheid struggle, and whether there is anything to say about that, because I think it's a very difficult experience to capture. And I certainly know my children, who are sentient, interested young adults, have great difficulty in understanding what those times were about. So I'm raising the question there, whether you can elaborate further, either of you or both of you, about how the respective audiences who will view this film now may be able to relate to the extent of the oppression that was present, certainly the sense of hopelessness that was present amongst dissident people in that terribly authoritarian fascist environment, and ultimately the desperation that was part of the subjective experience. I think they are reasonable points to consider. Are there any comments?
Yeah, well, I would just like to say that I'm normally an optimist, but I have a feeling, and I don't have children, but I know a lot of young people, and I think it's a bit like parents saying you didn't know what it was like in the war. And to them, they're in the middle of their lives, and we go to South Africa, we visit, we see these black people and white people all walking along, totally living their lives. And so I feel a bit sad that you can't force your children or your a younger generation, but I think things move on. But just to sort of to say, the reason I thought that Kevin's film and anything else about John was important was because it was an extremely significant event, no matter where you stand and how you view it. And I think it does need to be built into the history of South Africa. But sadly, I think people are living their lives now. I doubt, maybe that's a little bit negative, and I would like Kevin, who's got children and possibly grandchildren, to contradict me.
Well, Kevin, can you do that?
Well, I think that what I'd just like to say is, because I think what Jane has said is true. People move on, and as you say, what I did in the war, and kind of that kind of reflecting back. But that is why I feel it is, as a filmmaker, for me, it's so important to make a film that is engaging on a human interest level, because it doesn't matter about the time, the place, etc. That if you are somebody, either has a family, or you have a brother, you have a father, you have a son, etc. You can engage on a human interest level with the family, with the Harris family, with John, with the circumstances he found himself in this very oppressive system. I mean, there are many, many oppressive systems over the period of time and currently today. So whichever one so the idea is that you engage and you identify. So it's not a textbook, but the backdrop, the historic backdrop is there. I mean, we outline everything. We outline, the Sharpeville massacre, all the things that would have influenced John as a young man growing up and being sensitive and being, aware and being concerned about social justice. These are all the things that would have influenced a young man like that, and did influence him. And finally, I mean, the Rivonia trial was happening. Mandela was being imprisoned. All these things, and at the same time, John and Anne had a young baby. So there's a whole lot of human interest complexities, which I feel, if you are the least bit sensitive and you're watching a film like this, you can identify on a human interest level. And then after the film, you can think about it in the context, this was apartheid South Africa, and then all the details can come out. So I think any age group can watch this film, and as I say, engage on human interest level, and then get the actual information as a backdrop to it.
Well, look, I think you've been very clear in the way you've looked at that and provided your views. And I agree. I think it's so compelling and it's so well made that engagement is not going to be an issue. It's the content that, as to how people will relate to it, that would be interesting to see at a film festival like this, where the audience will be diverse. I'm just mindful of the length of this recording, and perhaps we need to think of bringing it to some sort of a closure. And Jane, this is a difficult question to ask you, but you've actually had the experience of living a life where it was your brother who was known for having placed that bomb, regardless of the motivations, regardless of the intent. If you don't wish to talk about this, I absolutely understand. But it's a question that was in my mind, and I thought I would ask it.
Complicated question. When I came to Australia and didn't know many people, if I knew two, it took me a long time. I didn't go around talking about my family at all. And as I made very good friends, I would explain to them what had occurred. But nobody here would have known my background, and it wouldn't have occurred to them. And I think it's a really, it's part of my history. I don't talk about it lightly. I don't go around meeting people. If people say, did you have a brother? And I said, I will say, if I'm not engaged in deep conversation, yes, but unfortunately he was not well and he died. Or I'll make some sort of, they'll say, oh, I'm sorry. I'll make some sort of general remark. But I don't produce this information. It's part of me. For months on end, I don't think about any of this, and then there's a film. Or then something occurs which brings it all back. And as I say, for some sad reason, I have this incredible, I could write a book about everything that happened when and why. But it's, as I say, that my close friends are aware of this. And but otherwise, it's past tense, but that doesn't mean that it's not significant. And that's why I'm very glad that Kevin's film will be shown, because as you may be aware, Australia is full of white South Africans, and now non-white South Africans are coming in as well. And I suspect a great deal of the audience will be South Africans, ex-South Africans.
Yes, I've been to a number of the previous film festivals of this group, and of course that's who's there. But there's always a more diverse group than you would imagine.
Sure.
But thank you for that answer, and I appreciate that you did answer it, because I think it brings us to just what it leaves us with. And I think when you look at the remarkable bravery, when you look at the energy and the commitment of young people, and some of us were amongst those young people, the things we did, the risks we took, the determination we showed, one really has to look at where it leaves us now. And I think there are comments to be made about what we're seeing in the South Africa that has emerged post-apartheid. And in conclusion, then, perhaps if we can just talk a little bit about that, it might be a helpful way to be reflective and bring this to a close.
Okay, well, just very briefly, my feeling is incredible sadness, an incredible, to me, it's an utter tragedy it's a travesty of what people died for. And whether they're black or white doesn't matter. And I just think it is one of the saddest things in my life, and I don't think about it every day, but it is one of the most tragic things, that for what was all this done? And I thought, just an important point, I thought there would be inefficiency, incompetence, inexperience, all of which are totally acceptable and understandable, instead of which the cynicism and the greed and the avarice, to me, have marked me.
Kevin?
Yeah, I think that's, and in understanding Jane, I think that's why this film, one of the reasons why it is important, and why it is important that it's a document and that it is shown and that people see it today, is because it's a reminder. John's story and that of his family is a reminder that so many people, hundreds, thousands, sacrificed their lives, sacrificed their families, their family life for the vision, this vision of a socially just, equal post-apartheid South Africa. And what has transpired in South Africa, due to the corruption of the powers that be, is an absolute betrayal. And I can't use that word strongly enough.
Mm-hmm.
It is a betrayal of every single person that sacrificed, that died, of the young Solomon Mahlangu, who was hanged at age 22, of all those people that were executed for fighting apartheid, and all those people lying in a ditch somewhere that nobody knows about, that were just put away with by the security police. It is a betrayal of every single one of those people's commitment and sacrifices, and that of their families. And I think, yeah, it's an absolute betrayal.
I don't think there is a more powerful way of putting this into its proper perspective. Unfortunately, we do have to conclude, but I thank you both for just engaging in the way you have. It certainly made my task very straightforward, but obviously there's a lot of emotional distress that gets stirred up, which is inevitable. But I thank you for your contributions, and I hope that when viewing this segment, people will be drawn to watching what I think is a very significant film that will move many people. Thank you very much.
Thank you.